So while I was on sabbatical last year, I visited Louisville, Kentucky. And on the recommendation of Carla Matheson, I stopped by what is truly one of the great museums in all of America, the Muhammad Ali Center. One of all of the exhibits in the center, and there are many, you can dance around in the ring that Ali trained in when he fought Sonny Liston. You can go into like a virtual reality simulator and shadow box with Layla Ali, who's a world champion in and of her own right. But one of the exhibitions that really spoke to me was the one about Ali's humanitarian work. I really think that Ali's courage outside the ring dwarfed his courage inside the ring. And many of the fights in his later career, the ones that really did an extraordinary amount of damage to his brain, that really sped along his symptoms of Parkinson's disease and ultimately led to the paralyzation of his larynx, silencing one of the great poets of our day. Many people have asked, why did Ali continue to fight? Well, that's a very simple question with a very complex answer. But at least one aspect of the answer to that question of why did Ali continue to fight was the fact that most of the purse that he earned in those later fights, almost 98% of those purses went directly to the charities and the causes that Ali believed so much in. Ali literally sacrificed his body for others. And we Christians know a little something about bodies being broken in a spirit of love for our neighbors. And in this section of the center that is dedicated to Ali's humanitarian aid work, there is a particular section which really does show the fruits that Ali reaped with his efforts. I'm speaking of framed thank you cards that people sent to Ali in response to his generosity and his gentleness and his kindnesses. There's a framed letter from a woman, a single mom of 3, whose house burned down in Louisville, and Ali read the headline about the tragedy, and he sent a check for $50,000 so that she could rebuild her house. Complete stranger, didn't know her, just read about it. There's a big old construction paper thank you card with really bad handwriting from a first grade class thanking Ali for the bicycles that he bought them. And there is one from a young man typed on one of those old school typewriters that met Ali one day in the boxing gym. The young man was a brilliant student and a horrible boxer. And and I think I get the story correct, when Ali told him that he needs to step out of the boxing ring and go to college. Because as Ali told him, he should use his brain to split the atom before his brain gets split in the ring. And the young man did just that. He went to college, but he couldn't afford it. So Ali promised to pay all of his tuition, all the way to him getting a PhD in physics. Now, all of these acts of charity and generosity were done quietly. No one knew about them. There was no press conference. There was no Facebook post. There was no Instagram selfie with the recipients of these gifts so the masses could like it. No, Muhammad Ali did this all very quietly and secretively whenever he felt so moved. Now, I don't share this with you because Muhammad Ali was a saint. If any of you know who Muhammad Ali was and have read his biographies, know his history, you know that he was no saint by any stretch of the imagination. He was an extremely flawed human being, just as we are extremely flawed human beings. And yet, this flawed human being was moved time and time again to live out the powerful words of the the epistle of 1 Timothy, which reads that we ought to pursue righteousness and godliness, faith and love, endurance and gentleness. And I know every time that I have ever been in the midst of someone who has lived out these words and become an incarnation of these words, as I know you have been, I become very inspired by such stories and the examples that these people set. And these thank you cards reveal a side of Ali that in his most quiet and private moments, that Ali tried to live a virtuous life. And his striving for virtuousness impacted so many people through his compassion and generosity. And it's one of the easiest sermons I can preach. We ought to do the same. In our flawedness, in our journey through life, we ought to strive to be generous and compassionate and kind as individuals, as a community. Because as the earliest church, from its very inception, from the day of Pentecost to right now in the 21st century, we have been called to the godly life which is rooted and grounded in generosity and kindness and gentleness. And the Reverend Caroline Lewis, the professor of homiletics at Luther Seminary, reminds us of what was going on in that first century church, which kind of sounds a little bit about what's going on in our 21st century church. You might remember that I told you weeks ago when we started 1 Timothy that pretty much every scholar, from conservative to progressive, from traditional to avant-garde, pretty much agrees that Paul did not write 1 Timothy, but that the person who did write 1 Timothy is steeped in Pauline theology and was kind of writing a, what would Paul have to say about everything that's going on in the world? And by the close of the first century, when 1 Timothy was written, the church was going through a severe and wide-ranging bit of changes. It is starting to grow out of and being considered a sect of Judaism. And it was starting to be recognized as its own tradition. It was even being called the way, that our ideologies and our ideas were actually also lived out in our behavior and on our journey. And the biggest change that was coming was the fact that more and more Gentiles were joining the church and less Jews, which means more and more people were joining the church who weren't raised with Jewish family ethics, which says that we are responsible for our brothers and sisters, and more people were being raised with Roman ideology of status and power and hierarchy. And the writer of 1 Timothy does not like this change. The writer particularly doesn't like what has happened in terms of the financial stewardship of the church. You see, a great deal of money has been given to Ephesus. Big donors are starting to attend, and they're trying to change the church with them. And that communitarian ethos, that we're all in this together and that we'll all take care of each other, is beginning to wane. And so instead, an ethos of quid pro quo has infiltrated the church. And the ways that the world separate people out there in terms of hierarchy and status and privilege is starting to seep inside the church. And it's becoming harder and harder for folks who are really in need, particularly widows who in the first century were the most vulnerable, to get the need that they desperately need to get. And so Dr. Lewis reminds us that the writer of 1 Timothy is telling us that we ought to live out the gospel message, to have a spirit of generosity, and to bring back that communitarian ethos that defined the early church. That idea that we will take care of those within our sphere of influence who are hurting and ailing and who are vulnerable. Now, the writer of 1 Timothy gives us one of the most famous sayings in all of biblical literature. It has transcended the church and gone out into the culture. This is the words that says, money is the root of all evil. How many of you have heard that? Money, of course you have. We've all heard it before. Money is the root of all evil. But as Lisa Simpson tells Bart, as usual, the playground has the facts right, but it's missed the point entirely. You see, if we translate 1 Timothy 6:10 exactly and without taking any license for poetic sentence flow, it does not say that money is the root of all evil. In fact, it says, a root of all kinds of sin is greed and stinginess, which some stretching after has been seduced away from the practices of the faith. Now, you can't really put that on a bumper sticker, can you? The word here is for the sin of greed and stinginess is maimonis, which is also the name of a Syrian god, an imp, really, who tempts people to be greedy and stingy. This is mine, and I'm going to keep it for me. So when Jesus in the Gospel of Luke says one cannot serve God and money, he's literally saying one cannot serve Yahweh and mammon, One cannot serve the one true God of love, and one cannot serve the false god of greed and stinginess. Love and greed and stinginess are incompatible in the eyes of Jesus. One is the way of God, and the other is the path to falseness. But we are so lucky that God does not leave us stranded along our false path, but by God's grace, God redeems us back from the sin of greed and stinginess and sets us back on the narrow way of Christ in a spirit of unconditional generosity and love that God has for us all. One of my most distinct privileges in my life was sitting on the board of trustees of Heidelberg College. And I sat on that board with the famed federal judge, Damon Keith. Judge Keith was a pillar in the civil rights movement, particularly in the Midwest, where civil rights struggle kind of went underneath the radar compared to the struggle in the South. And I learned a lot from Judge Keith in the short time that I had the honor to work with him. I was at Heidelberg College in 2005 when I heard a most remarkable story upon the death of Rosa Parks. Justice Keith and Rosa Parks were good friends. And in 1994, Judge Keith worked to secure Rosa Parks a new apartment. Now, not many people know that Rosa Parks moved to Detroit shortly after her stint in Memphis or in Montgomery in 1955 after leading the Boyce boycott. And as is the case with Mrs. Parks, she was living on the very edge of poverty. Like so many elderly people in our society today, she was living one paycheck at a time, one Social Security paycheck at a time, barely making it. And in 1994, at age 81, Mrs. Parks' apartment in Detroit was broken into by a young man looking for money, and she was assaulted and sent to the hospital. She was hurt very badly. And when her friend, Judge Keith, learned of this, he secured for Miss Parks a new apartment in a much safer neighborhood in Detroit. But it was an apartment that was well above the means of Rosa Parks. She could barely pay for her previous apartment on the already stretched Social Security paycheck. And the story, though, of Miss Parks' assault and her hardships made the headlines in the Detroit Free Press. And the owner and founder of Little Caesars, the pizza guy, who also owned the Detroit Red Wings and the Detroit Tiger baseball team, Mike and Marion Ilitch, read the story and called Judge Keith. They asked how they could help. And Judge Keith told them exactly how they could help. Y'all can pay Rosa Parks' rent. You can pay her utilities. And the Ilitches did, indefinitely, starting in 1994 until Miss Rosa Parks died and went on to glory in 2005. And Judge Keith shared this story with us around the Board of Trustees table at Heidelberg College. He was trying to get the set before an example to the trustees about how we ought to live out our call and charge to care for the students who are in our care, as these young people, most of them the first person in their family to attend college, and most of them coming from very modest economic situations. And Judge Keith was upset because the Board of Trustees voted to raise tuition without raising financial aid, especially since Heidelberg had not drawn 100% of the income from the interest on the endowments. Now, this wasn't my fight. I was an ex officio member of the Board of Trustees. Plus, I was staff. But silently under my breath, I said a little amen for Judge Keith. And yes, Judge Keith got the financial aid raised along with tuition. But as remarkable as the Ilitch's care for Mrs. Parks was, and as remarkable as Judge Keith's power of moral and ethical persuasion were, I later learned what I think is even a more remarkable part of Rosa Parks' story in Detroit. Because not only did Rosa Parks live near the poverty line, but she also lived with the onset of dementia and Parkinson's. And in 2003, a year before her horrific assault that led Judge Keith and the Ilitches to step in to aid her, others were already aiding her when her diagnosis was given. The Hartford Baptist Memorial Church. You see, you don't have to be a multi-billionaire before we respond with communitarian spirit of generosity and love. When the Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, a historic black congregation in Detroit, learned of Mrs. Parks' diagnosis and her living near the poverty line, they collectively stepped in, using donations of $1, $5, $10, $50, $100, and more. They saw the need of Miss Parks that was in their sphere of influence, and with a spirit of generosity and compassion, they responded the best they could. They gave their time, their energies, their financial resources. They prayed for her. They took her to her doctor's appointments. They made her meals, and they paid her rent. Now, I can imagine the conversation going on around that council table. We've had those conversations here. If we help Mrs. Parks, then we'll have to help everyone who comes and asks for help. We don't have the resources to do this long term. Once our resources run out, what do we do then? Both of those are legitimate questions, ones that I ask myself each time a need presents itself to us here at Kensington. But this is the little-known truth that I have always come to experience. We never know where the resources are going to come from, and yet they are almost always there by the grace of God. For God works through a spirit of generosity, godliness, and gentleness to spread the gospel of love. Our spirits ought to be reawakened by 1 Timothy. Much like the shofar being blown on Rosh Hashanah, it stirs our heart and beckons us forth to share and spread the love of God through our generosity, compassion, and gentleness. For we as Christians have been called to the godly life, which is rooted and grounded in the spirit of generosity and compassion, love, and faith. And like the blowing of the shofar, may our helping those who are in our sphere of influence be done so with an amen and amen.